Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time we followed Jeb from his home at Laurel Hill in Patrick County, Virginia, to West Point and then to Texas. We left him as he was assigned to the 1st U.S. Cavalry at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Now let's see what his time in Kansas was like. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. Join the Patreon page or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. As the quartermaster of the 1st Cavalry Regiment, Stuart had the difficult job of procuring supplies and transporting it to the troops over difficult terrain. On one occasion, his company was stationed at Westport, Missouri, a few miles south of Kansas City. The day before his men and horses would run out of forage and rations, Stuart had to traverse gullies and thick forests through the night, riding 34 miles in 10 hours, arriving at Fort Leavenworth at 10 o'clock. He organized the loading of rations and forage, then led the teamsters and food through the difficult terrain. In some instances, trees had to be cut down to allow for the wagons to pass along the road. This one trip was part of Stuart's normal routine as the quartermaster. Fort Leavenworth in the summer of 1855 didn't look like much, with a few brick, stone, and log buildings making up the barracks and other military buildings. But to Stuart, it looked urban compared to the camps in Texas. Plus, women were at Fort Leavenworth. Stuart wrote, "Some 7 or 8 young ladies can always hoist a sail for amusement." However, one young lady caught Stuart's eye, the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Philip St. George Cook of the 2nd Dragoons. Her name was Flora. She had just finished her schooling at a finishing school, and her parents wanted her to go to Philadelphia, but she wanted to visit her parents in Fort Leavenworth. The first time Jeb saw Flora was during a review for the troops. She was on a nervous horse, but she handled the animal beautifully, and she was an excellent rider. Knowing his own love of horses and horsemanship, Stuart's infatuation soared. Stuart asked Flora if she would like to go on a ride with him. She agreed, and soon they were going on rides every evening. Flora was more than a good rider. She could even shoot, and she was a Virginian. Like Stuart, she sang and even played the guitar. As one of Stuart's biographers wrote, Stuart was more than charmed, he was smitten. In September 1855, less than 2 months after their first ride together, they were engaged to be married. Stuart described the courtship in Latin, Vena vidi victus sum. I came, I saw, I was conquered. They planned a November wedding at Fort Riley, Kansas, where Flora's father was now stationed. Lieutenant Colonel Cook stated that he thought his daughter's wedding plans were rather sudden, but he described his soon-to-be son-in-law as a remarkably fine and promising pure young man. Before he could get married, Jeb's troop needed to go on an extended patrol along the Oregon Trail toward Laramie. Along with planning a wedding, the nearly 900-mile journey required his logistical planning as quartermaster. When he returned from the expedition, he received 2 letters, one from his father consenting to the marriage, and the second from Flora telling him of Archibald's death on September 20th. Although Stuart described the situation as heartrending, the father and son didn't have much of a relationship because they simply did not spend much time together. Jeb and Flora were married on November 14th, 1855 in a small wedding, and Flora wore her graduation dress. The two moved to Fort Leavenworth but didn't remain long because Stuart got leave to take his wife to Virginia to meet his family. After a whirlwind tour, Stuart headed back to Fort Leavenworth and Flora remained in the east to recuperate from the fast-paced tour. Elizabeth Stuart, Flora's now mother-in-law, attempted to gift her a slave to take back to Kansas, but because slavery was such a contested issue in Kansas, Flora refused the gift. On December 20th, 1855, Stuart was promoted to first lieutenant in appreciation for his abilities and talents as quartermaster. The meager pay of a soldier made Stuart look elsewhere for additional income to support his family. He would stay in the army, but he dabbled in real estate, buying and selling land in Leavenworth, going in on business ventures, sometimes winning and sometimes losing, but this allowed Stuart to live more comfortably and provide a nice life for he and his wife. Stuart exhibited an almost cutthroat way of looking at the world when he wrote to a cousin he frequently corresponded with in St. Louis, Missouri. I may speak freely as I am without such advantages myself. I am embittered against modern fashionable society. When I find myself elbowed in saloons by the puppies who plume themselves upon $100,000, a handsome person, and a European tour. Believing himself superior in spirit and mind, Stuart had decided not to meet these gentlemen in lists, where they are my superiors, Stuart determined to gain position, information, influence, a name first, and then, with the prestige of a name, go if we choose and make the denizens of fashion bow before us. Stuart advised his cousin to find his success in southwestern Virginia, where he could become a country gentleman of fortune, and then confront wider society with his superiority knowledge. Having lectured his cousin on the law and counseled him about life, Stuart proceeded to preach to him on the practice of virtue. Virtue, in Stuart's mind, was the opposite of the elegant vices of city life, and he had no good feelings for society either, invoking the parable of the prodigal son in language if not by name. Stuart decried his first cousin's new-made city friend, and concluded the voices of home and friends and patriotism and old associations cry, "Come back, come back." When Flora returned to Fort Leavenworth, it was as if they had never parted. Flora had been raised in a military family and understood and accepted that her husband would be gone for long periods of time. In December 1856, Flora would become pregnant with their first child. 1856 was a tense time in Kansas. Popular sovereignty, the concept that citizens of a state or territory could decide whether to be free or slave, resulted in a small civil war within the proposed state. It became known as Bleeding Kansas, as each side attempted to punish the other and run them out of the state, or make them so afraid that they bent to the other's will. The Army's job was to keep the peace as much as possible. In June 1856, Stuart and his detachment, led by Colonel Edwin Sumner, rode into camp of some armed Free Soilers. Sumner's orders were to disperse armed bands. The Free Soilers were led by a man named John Brown. A few days before, at the Battle of Blackjack, Brown and his men had fought a battle with pro-slavery forces and won, taking some prisoners. Sumner convinced Brown to release his prisoners, which included a man named Henry Clay Pate, a former student at the University of Virginia and a deputy United States Marshal. Stuart did little more than watch the proceedings. In the summer of 1857, an increase in attacks on white settlers by the Cheyenne led the 1st Cavalry to launch a campaign against the tribe. Jeb began the campaign as a quartermaster, but when he and Sumner disagreed over accountability procedures involving government property, Sumner removed him as quartermaster and gave him command of Company G of the 1st Cavalry. The expedition left Fort Leavenworth with 4 cavalry companies, a 6-mule ambulance, 300 beef cattle, and 50 wagons carrying supplies, food, equipment, and ammunition. When it got to Fort Kearny on June 4th, it acquired infantry, some dragoons, Pawnee scouts, and more wagons. The group continued to Fort Laramie, where the dragoons left for service in Utah, but the rest continued after the Cheyenne. On July 29, 1857, after 18 months on the frontier, Jeb saw his first hostile Native American. It was on Solomon's Fork of the Smoky Hill River in northwest Kansas. Sumner assembled his force, intending for his center to hold the Cheyenne in place while his wings hit the flanks. Stuart wanted to advance within carbine range, fire a volley, and then charge with revolvers. But when they got to within carbine range, Sumner ordered draw sabers, charge. The Cheyenne broke before the Federal soldiers had time to collide with them, and now it became a pursuit. Stuart and 3 others, including an officer named Lunsford Lomax, chased after the Cheyenne for longer than the others, going for 5 miles. Stuart's horse Dan gave out, so Stuart hailed a private who traded him horses. On a new mount, Jeb gave chase. When he caught up to his comrades, they had cornered a lone Cheyenne warrior. Stuart charged him and shot him in the thigh with his revolver as he rode by. Another soldier dismounted and was going to shoot the Indian, but the gun went off accidentally before he had time to aim. Defenseless, the soldier stood next to his mount, with the wounded Indian limping closer with the revolver, ready to shoot him. Stuart charged again, now with his saber. The charging horseman got the Indian's attention. As Stuart's blade crashed into the Indian's skull, the Cheyenne's pistol discharged into Stuart's chest. 2 other soldiers ended the Indian's life, and Stuart gingerly got off his horse. The Kansas sun was bearing down on the wounded soldier, so his comrades stuck their sabers into the ground and stretched a blanket over them to shield Jeb from the sun. When Sumner arrived, he ordered Stuart to be carried to where the engagement began. They got 3 miles before the doctor arrived. The doctor examined him and found that Stuart was lucky. The bullet hit his sternum and deflected, lodging beneath his left nipple. The bullet hit nothing vital, and as long as infection didn't set in, Jeb would make a full recovery. The cavalry officer was bandaged up and rode on some cushions attached to a 2-wheeled cart made from a broken ambulance. The pain grew with each bump in the road, and the soreness coursed through his upper body. On July 31st, Stuart and the other wounded men along with one Cheyenne prisoner, were escorted toward Fort Kearny, while the rest of the force chased after the Indians. Stuart and the detachment rested for a few days before setting off for the 120-mile journey. On August 4th, a small group of Cheyenne attacked their camp, but they were driven away without casualties to either side. The group began their march to Fort Kearny, reliant on the Pawnee guides sent from Sumner. However, a few days into the trip, the guides left them, and with no compass, the group was completely lost. Stuart, not fully healed but healthy enough to withstand the job, volunteered to lead a scouting party to find their way to Fort Kearny. Stuart used stakes drilled into the ground to find his way back. At one point, a storm blew through. The soldiers were forced to sit on their grounded saddles with their head down as the rain and wind beat them until the storm blew over. Clouds prevented Stuart from reading the stars to determine the direction of north, but on the night of August 16th, the night watch woke Stuart up. The clouds dispersed and the stars were prominent. Stuart got a bearing and the next morning headed north, where he got to a river. The group traveled upstream to a ford, and on the other side was a wagon road. Now Stuart knew where he was. This was the Big Blue River, and the wagon road was the one that carried people from Fort Leavenworth to Fort Kearny. The group arrived at Fort Kearny on August 17th, and a rescue party left the fort to find the lost detachment. In September 1857, Flora gave birth to their first child, who Jeb insisted to be named after the child's mother. Stuart proclaimed that I have the prettiest and smartest baby in North America. Also that fall, the Stuarts moved to Fort Riley, where Jeb was transferred. The new father continued to speculate in land, and even tried his hand at invention. He developed a detachable clip made for a sword and scabbard, so a soldier wouldn't have to take off his belt to take off his sword. The Army was so impressed with his invention that the War Department gave him a 6-month leave of absence in the latter half of 1859 to go to Washington, procure a patent, and negotiate the sale of his saber hook. He would use the leave to attend the General Convention of the Episcopal Church as a lay delegate. Although he joined the Methodist Church at Emory and Henry, he most likely gravitated toward the Episcopals because Army chaplains tended to be Episcopalians. He also helped found the Episcopal Church of the Covenant in Junction City, Kansas, while stationed at Fort Riley. He officially became an Episcopalian in St. Louis on his way to the General Convention. While in Virginia on leave, he visited family, even paying a visit to Emory and Henry College, giving a speech to the Hermesian Society, telling the story about his last speech 10 years before when he fell off the platform. In Washington, he patented his saber hook and then sold it to the government for $5,000 and would receive $1 for each device sold by the manufacturer. He was outside the War Department offices in Washington waiting for a meeting with Secretary of War Floyd on October 17th when he heard whispers about trouble happening at a place called Harper's Ferry. The rumors swirled and grew as Stuart listened. 3,000 men were said to have taken over the federal arsenal and armory in the town, with most of them being black. It was a slave revolt. Stuart was there when Floyd decided to do something about the alleged revolt, and the young officer volunteered to take a summons from the War Office to Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was across the Potomac River at Arlington on leave. Stuart had visited the Lees at Arlington before, but this was official business. Lee and Stuart went to the White House with Floyd to discuss what to do next. The only available troops were about 90 Marines at the Naval Yard and some Maryland militia, so that would have to do for the moment. Virginia militia were already there, and more were on the way. Lee was placed in command of the operation, and Stuart volunteered to be Lee's aide. Lee and Stuart set off on a train to Harper's Ferry. They met the Marines about a mile outside of the town, where Lee learned that the size of the force at Harper's Ferry had been exaggerated. It was only a handful of armed men, and they were trapped in the fire engine house. Their leader was named Smith, and his men and their hostages were still in the engine house when Lee, Stuart, and the Marines arrived in town. Lee ordered the building surrounded and then drew up the surrender terms to be delivered to the men in the engine house. Stuart would give the terms of immediate surrender to Smith and his band of men. Lee anticipated that the surrender terms would be rejected, so he prepared the Marines to assault the engine house when Stuart gave the signal. The Marines were not to fire their weapons, only bayonets were to be used, so that no one innocent would get hit by a stray bullet. On the morning of October 18th, Stuart went up to one of the big doors of the engine house with his white flag. When Stuart addressed the men inside the engine house, the door opened about 4 inches, and the snout of a carbine came out and put in Stuart's face. Mr. Smith was the one aiming the rifle, but Stuart recognized the old man. Not as Mr. Smith, but as John Brown from Kansas. Stuart read the surrender terms, but Brown immediately tried to bargain. wanting safe passage out of Harper's Ferry for the hostages. Jeb declined the bargain, and as he did so, one of the hostages, Lewis Washington, a distant descendant of President Washington, yelled out, "Never mind us, fire!" Lee recognized the voice and called out, "The Revolutionary blood does tell." Realizing that Brown wouldn't surrender, Stuart waved his hat and stepped out of the way. The Marines began to beat on the door with sledgehammers, but it wasn't damaging the door, so they picked up a ladder and used it as a battering ram to knock a hole in the door, through which the Marines poured and overtook Brown and his company. Once Brown was in custody, Stuart relieved Brown of his Bowie knife and kept it as a souvenir. Lee then dispatched Stuart and some troops to the Kennedy Farm, a farmhouse used by Brown to prepare for the raid on Harper's Ferry. Jeb collected the documents and weapons stored at the house and brought them to Harper's Ferry. During the interrogation of Brown, Stuart listened until Brown stated that the Golden Rule justified his deeds. Stuart fired back, "But don't you believe in the Bible?" Brown said that he did, and that pretty much ended Stuart's interaction during the interrogation. It wasn't long after the involvement in the suppression of the raid on Harper's Ferry that Stuart returned to Kansas. He invested the $5,000 in the Bank of the State of Missouri that would get him 10% interest. After his role at Harper's Ferry, Stuart hoped to gain a captaincy in the Army. Since 1857, he had been on a campaign gathering support for that promotion, writing especially to the governor of Virginia, Henry Wise, to support such a promotion. The new governor that took office in 1860 was John Letcher, an uncle to his mother. Stuart's hopes increased since he now had a family member in office. In a letter to his mother, Jeb demonstrated his yearning for the promotion and recognition for his service in capturing John Brown. "I feel that I did all that my position allowed me to do, and for it I claim nothing. But if a bill passed the legislature of Virginia, rewarding Lieutenant Israel Green, the commander of the Marines at Harper's Ferry, and not including me, I would feel exceedingly mortified. I shall certainly expect every friend I have in either house, if I have any, to insist upon my being included. To reduce the thing to a nutshell, it is this: Green was ordered to do what he did. I voluntarily left important business in Washington and accompanied Colonel Lee. Green is a resolute noble fellow, and Virginia might well vote him thanks, a sword or something, but remember what I said." The tumultuous year of 1860 and its presidential election wasn't watched as closely by Stuart as some, in part because Stuart wasn't that political. He subscribed to the Richmond Examiner, which editorially was pro-secession, but he ultimately was a Virginiaphile, following what Virginia's course would be. But the biggest reason he didn't watch the politics unfold in 1860 was because for months the 1st Cavalry were assigned to launch operations against the Kiowa and Comanche. He would be away from Flora when she had their second child in June of 1860. His name was Philip St. George Cook Stuart, named after Flora's father. During that summer, Jeb lived on the frontier chasing after Indians, eating buffalo meat roasted over an open fire on a stick, and having freshly caught fish for almost every meal. On an assignment to find water, Stuart rode 120 miles in 35 hours, with only 1.5 hours of sleep. In July, he finally found the elusive Kiowa and their chief, Satonko. The chase began at Bent's Fort in modern-day Colorado, and went for 26 miles. A patrol from Bent's Fort spotted the dust clouds and mistook Stuart's command for the Kiowa and ordered a charge. Jeb quickly realized what was happening and ordered his bugler to sound off so that those soldiers knew who they were. It worked, and an incident was avoided. The two cavalry units merged and continued the chase. They were chasing not only Kiowa warriors, but also women and children, as the entire village was on the move. What resulted was the Battle of Blackwater Springs, and saw a handful of casualties on each side, including the chief's brother and son. Some women and children were taken captive and kept at Bent's Fort as hostages to ensure safe travel for whites moving through the area. In early August, John Sedgwick, the leader of the cavalry contingent, ordered his forces back to Fort Riley. Stuart made it back to Flora on August 15th to find a beautiful baby boy. However, he didn't stay long with his growing family. In September, his troops set off again to the east of Bent's Fort to establish Fort Wise on the Arkansas River. By November, Stuart constructed a comfortable home for he and his family and planned to move Flora and the children there in the spring. The uncertainty of the secession winter is reflected in Jeb's letter-writing campaign. He wrote a letter to John Letcher, the governor of Virginia, asking for help getting a promotion to captain, but if secession occurred, would tender his services to Virginia. In a letter to Jefferson Davis in January 1861, knowing that Davis would have some role in the military in a southern nation, asked for a place in the Army if Virginia seceded. He wrote to his brother William Alexander Stuart in Wytheville, Virginia, suggesting to raise a legion of cavalry from the county for service in Virginia, and if no war broke out, but Virginia seceded, he would resign from the Army and practice law in Memphis, Tennessee. Stuart worked for a law office in his younger days, but had no training in law, and if he was focused on Virginia, why would he settle in Memphis? Those statements are confusing, and answers may never be known as to why he thought he wanted to be a lawyer in Memphis. Stuart also wrote to Abraham Lincoln's Attorney General Edward Bates to attempt to get a promotion to captain in the United States Army if Virginia didn't secede. On March 4, 1861, Stuart got a 2-month leave from the Army. He first traveled to Fort Riley, and then St. Louis, then back to Fort Riley, trying to get an understanding of the political situation erupting in the country. When he learned that Virginia voted for secession in mid-April, he packed his stuff and took his family east, first to St. Louis, then took a steamboat down the Mississippi River to Memphis. At Cairo, Illinois, he mailed his resignation letter from the Army, and mailed a letter asking the Adjutant General of the Confederacy, Samuel Cooper, for a position in the Army commensurate to his rank. Stuart's mother wrote a letter to Robert E. Lee, now commanding Virginia's forces, asking for a place for her son in Virginia's army. By train, the family moved through Tennessee, then on to Richmond, Virginia. On May 10th, Robert E. Lee, his mentor at West Point, gave Stuart the rank of lieutenant colonel in the Provisional Army of Virginia. The young man went from lieutenant to lieutenant colonel overnight, and would fight for his home state of Virginia. At the beginning of 1861, amid the turmoil of secession, Stuart expressed his politics succinctly. For my part, I have no hesitancy from the first that, right or wrong, alone or otherwise, I go with Virginia.